Today we're at the Sheffield Memorial Park, just on the outskirts of the small village of Serre. This is the northern section of the front line of the Somme, and today we're going to explore the grounds where the Pals battalions attacked in that opening offensive of the Battle of the Somme. So as I mentioned, today we're just outside Serre, the Sheffield Memorial Park. Now, I mentioned this was the northern section of the Somme battlefield, and that is true, but I should reference there was some fighting further north from here at Gomicourt as part of a diversionary attack, but the actual Somme offensive front line kind of officially was here. This is the northern section just outside Serre, and here is where a lot of the newly formed Pals battalions were going to attack on the first day of the Somme. In late 1914, it was clear that the British Army was going to need an awful lot of men. They needed to recruit a lot of men to expand the army as the war was growing. That's where the famous Lord Kitchener posters come from. The "Your country needs you" and the pointing. That was the recruitment to start the drive of recruiting the Pals battalions. The idea behind the Pals battalions was to create a camaraderie in the hope that if men were given the opportunity to join up alongside friends, family members, colleagues at work, people from the same communities, towns, villages and cities, that they would be more likely to join up. The idea of going to war with their comrades, with their pals, with their friends would make it more likely for people to come forwards. When the recruitment campaign was launched in August 1914, the hope was to recruit 100,000 men. But by early September, nearly 500,000 men had come forward and volunteered to join the Allied forces. Where we are today, this is a section of the Somme front line where many of those newly formed Pals battalions were going to go into the fight. Now we're just going to move up slightly here and talk a little bit about the positions of where we are. So right now I'm stood just outside the front of the Sheffield Memorial Park, and we're going to talk a little bit about what's going on in here behind me in a second. But where I am right now is roughly the position of the British front line on the first day of the Somme. Now when people come here, there is a big kind of obvious trench line that runs here behind me, just inside the fence at the front of the Sheffield Memorial Park, and people often assumed that was the frontline trench, so much so that I thought that when I first came here, but actually that is a reserve line trench. The frontline trench would have been just on the other side of the road right here next to us, but this was the frontline attack on the first day of the Somme. To give you an idea, the Pals battalions were lined up here ready to go and ready to attack towards Serre in this direction. So across here would have been no man's land, and this is where the advance would have been. Now already from this point here you can probably see we are looking at a vast section of open land that slopes uphill towards the German defences, and that was going to prove to be a pretty tough situation for those Pals battalions, which we're going to talk about in just a minute. Where we're stood right now, this is roughly where the Accrington Pals would have attacked from. Off here to my left, we would have had the Barnsley Pals, and then the Sheffield City Battalion Pals right here. Accrington Pals are where we are, and then off to my right-hand side would have been the Leeds Pals. We've talked about the Leeds Pals before when we were here telling the story of Horace Isles. He attacked with the Leeds Pals just across the way there. So those battalions we just talked about were the first wave that was going to go over the top and attack here at Serre. Just behind them would have been more Barnsley Pals, the Bradford Pals and the Durham Pals. So we had a dominated area here with the newly formed Pals battalions that were going to attack across this open piece of land towards the German front line. Okay, so I've just spun us around slightly here so we can take a look at what's going on. So here we are, this is the entrance to the Sheffield Memorial Park, and right here is that reserve line trench that I talked about, which runs down here. And over in this direction. Right here in front of us on the other side of this track is where the actual main front line would have been. And the objective of these men was going to be to attack to across this piece of ground towards Serre. Those little buildings and trees and hedges you can see out there on the horizon, that is the edge of Serre. Today it is it's almost just a little cluster of buildings, but that is the village of Serre. Now, there had been a substantial preliminary bombardment on the German front lines here for a week prior to the first day of the Battle of the Somme. And the men here had been told that this was going to be very much a casual walk across no man's land, or almost an occupying force to move forwards across this land here and take the empty German trenches and the empty German positions that had been completely destroyed. They were supposed to advance across here and capture those German positions, expecting very little resistance. So at 0 hour, 7:30 a.m, the whistles went and the Pals battalions advanced forwards here across no man's land towards Serre. The German defenders, who had been hidden away in deep dugouts, deep defences, where they had been heavily protected by the artillery bombardment put down on them, they came out of their defences, they manned their machine guns, they took up their rifle positions, and they opened fire on the Pals battalions who were crossing this open section of land. So we are now walking forwards in very much the direction where those men would have advanced. As I mentioned, they were subject to machine gun fire, rifle fire, and as they got out into the open here, the German artillery came down on them as well. It was believed that German artillery would have been destroyed by the British artillery bombardment, but unfortunately that was not the case. So as the men got up here into the wide open, the fire coming down on them was horrendous, and the first wave was absolutely cut down. Behind them, the second wave went over the top. Now, whilst the first wave might have been convinced that this was going to be a cakewalk, the second wave had seen what happened. And it's tough to imagine the bravery of the men in that second wave who went over the top and advanced across this piece of land. The reason I wanted to walk up here towards the cemetery, and we're going to talk about the cemetery itself in a minute, is as we get to the outskirts of the cemetery here, we are getting to the point that is just about as far as any of the men managed to advance. If we look back, that's where we left the British front line. And just this short distance ahead, this is about as far as a lot of those men managed to get. So we've just come forwards and we are now stood in that cemetery that we were looking at. This is the Queen's Cemetery here at Serre. If we look further across the field, you can see Serre just in the distance here behind me. Now it is believed, or it's known, that some men did advance further than this point. Some even got into the German front lines, but many of them were never seen again. The German defences here were strong. The Germans had been well protected in their dugouts. Their machine gun fire and their artillery fire was devastating. And the attack towards Serre here almost completely failed. Now, when you come and look at the graves here in the Queen's Cemetery, a lot of the graves here are actually from later than July. For example, if we have a look over here, we have T. Cody of the East Lancashire Regiment killed on the 2nd of July, the next day. But we also have later, so for example over here, E.L. Bodycombe from the Royal Welsh Fusiliers, killed on the 13th of November 1916. So this area here at Serre, as I mentioned, the attack here failed on the 1st of July, and the battle here continued until much later. The Battle of the Somme runs through to November, but the fighting here carried on beyond that. And so there are graves here from beyond the 1st of July. But there are some which are. For example, we have J.F. Hitchin of the East Lancashire Regiment killed here on the attack on the 1st of July. And of course, this area remained no man's land for quite a while, and so that meant that many of the men who lay out here in no man's land weren't recovered for a long time, and unfortunately that meant that many of them couldn't be identified. So we have several soldiers here who are unknown. Okay, we're going to head back across and take a look in the Sheffield Memorial Park itself. So when you arrive here at the Sheffield Memorial, you have a couple of monuments in the area itself, which we're going to talk about. And just to kind of reorientate you again, this is where the front lines was in no man's land, looking across towards Serre. So let's go in and check out the actual Sheffield Memorial Park now. So when you come through the gate here, one of the first things you see just to your right-hand side is the memorial to the York and Lancaster Regiment, the Barnsley Pals. So we saw a grave from the Lancaster Regiment in the Queen's Cemetery. The Barnsley Pals were part of that regiment. And here we can see we have the memorial, 1914 to 1918, 13th and 14th Battalions, York and Lancashire Regiment, Barnsley Pals, dedicated to the memory of those who fell here 1st of July 1916 at the start of the Battle of the Somme. We will remember them. You have a couple of other smaller sort of memorial plaques here as well. So here we have in remembrance of the Barnsley Pals, and here we have a bit about the memorial dedication just attached to the tree here. The other thing which they have here, which is really cool, is when you come in, they have this information panel, and this is really useful because this gives you a real kind of idea of the area that we're talking about. Now, where we are stood right now, we have just come into the Memorial Park, so we are around here. We were looking across to Serre, so this is Serre, and here you can see this is where the British front lines were, and this is where the German front lines were. Each of these marks are machine gun points, and so you can see the situation the guys there were walking into. Now this section of trees, whilst now it is all grown into one kind of big long area of trees, this would have been 4 individual copse of trees, so it was a lot more open than it looks today, and that is kind of positioned on here where you can see the different sort of areas of the front line here, and you can see where the different regiments were as well. So the pink here is the Yorks and Lancashire Regiment, the yellow is the East Lancashire Regiment where we had the Accrington Pals, and as we move down we move into where the Leeds Pals were as well. So as we move across to the other side, whilst I mentioned this isn't a frontline trench, there is still a definite remains of a trench here in the front section of the Sheffield Memorial Park, and we're walking in that right now. And as you head down here, you come along to the memorial to the Accrington Pals. So here we are stood in that remains of the reserve line trench here and into no man's land. And over here is the memorial to the Accrington Pals. So dedicated to the memory of members of the Accrington Pals, many of whom fell here during the attack on Serre on the 1st of July. So the Accrington Pals left trenches right here in front of us advancing towards Serre, and they suffered some of the heaviest casualties, not just in this section of the Somme battlefield, but across all of the Somme battlefield. The Accrington Pals were almost completely wiped out here. Now, there is a full video that could be made about the Accrington Pals, and in fact, my friend Chris over on Vlogging Through History has made one. I'd urge you to check that out. In fact, I'll link it in the description below, but this is the memorial to the Accrington Pals. So in the middle of the memorial park here, we have this shelter, I suppose we will call it, and inside we have a little information plaque here in French on this side and then in English on the other side. And you can see here the park and memorial shelter are in honour of all Sheffield men who died for liberty during the World War 1914 to 1918. And goes on from there. And then we come out the back into the further back section of the park. Now, as we move through to the further back in the memorial park here, you start to see how torn up the ground here is. There are shell holes all over the place, and there's a little bit more of what I believe probably would have been trench remains over here behind us. But there is one huge shell hole you can see here behind us. I don't know if the camera is doing this justice, but this is a huge shell hole right here. Right in the middle of Sheffield Memorial Park. So we can be under no illusion. This area was heavily bombarded with artillery, and the guys here would have had one heck of a time. So just out the rear of where we were just now, so this is the area where we were up the hill, that you come down here into another cemetery, and this is the Railway Hollow Cemetery. Now where we are right now is in what would have been the British support line behind the front line, just on the top of the ridge here. Now this cemetery here contains graves from different parts of the offensives here. So we've already talked about the fact that there were attacks here in July 1916, again November 1916, and then in early 1917. And there are graves here of men who were cleared from the battlefields and brought back here for burial. And so we do see graves from all around that area. Now, some of these men is quite interesting. So for example, we have over here Corporal A. Hart of the East Lancashire Regiment. His actual death date is unknown, 1st or 2nd of July, and that probably is because his body was lost in no man's land for a period of time. We have H. Burton, 1st of July. 13th of November is D. McKickney, or I hope I said that right, of the Gordon Highlanders, who attacked here in November 1916. Something interesting in here as well. This is only a fairly small cemetery, but we also have a couple over here of slightly different looking gravestones, and these are French gravestones. So we have two French graves here in the cemetery. Now, the French graves here, I can't claim to know the specific story of them, but they would have been men who were killed in this area and then buried here. I'm going to absolutely butcher these names, and I do feel awful about it, but this is the grave of George Palvadou, I would guess, Morpul, France. And then we also have, just over here, the grave of Louis Lesord, Morpul, France. So the attack here at Serre was a complete failure. The Bradford Pals, for example, had nearly 1,400 men go into action here, with 1,000 of them becoming casualties. The Accrington Pals had nearly 700 men go into action here, with 600 of them becoming casualties here. So now we're going to take a walk from here back through to the main road that passes by Serre to finish off the story. So if ever you come here to Sheffield Memorial Park, you do have to walk a little bit to get here. It's not a huge distance, but it's not recommended that you drive to where it is, because it's along a track on farmland, and the farmer here does sometimes get a bit annoyed if people drive up to the memorial park. So from here we're going to walk down to the main road to the Serre No. 1 cemetery to round off our video. Let's go down there now. So as we get out here into the open, walking back through towards the main road, you basically kind of head along a farm track like this. Behind me, this is the Serre No. 3 cemetery. We haven't featured it on this video, but worth checking out if you come to this area. But where we are now, walking along this pathway right here, and it's very windy, so I apologise if the sound's not great. But this area is roughly where the British front line would have continued, and this specifically is where the Leeds Pals would have attacked from. Somewhere just in this area here is where Horace Isles would have attacked across no man's land here. So we've just come down to the Serre Road Cemetery #1, and if you come to Sheffield Memorial Park, there are several cemeteries here. Just next to us there is a big French cemetery. There is a Serre Road #2 cemetery just up the road. We briefly saw Serre Road #3. But #1 is definitely your starting point. And I would always recommend visiting as many of the cemeteries along the Somme as you can. You could fill your entire tour just with cemeteries. And I don't recommend that. It's really important. Get out, see the battlefields, but make a point of seeing some of the cemeteries because they really do tell the stories. These are the men who fought on these battlefields and they tell the story of what happened here. After the piece of ground here was eventually captured at Serre in spring 1917, the battlefields were cleared and the casualties were start to be brought into cemeteries. One of those cemeteries was Serre Road #1 cemetery, and 2 and 3. This cemetery specifically was begun in May 1917. Now, there are nearly 2,500 casualties in this cemetery here. Unfortunately, over 1,700 of them are unidentified. Now, the problem being, and the reason why that is the case, is that a lot of those men would have laid out there on the battlefield as casualties from the first day of the Somme through to spring 1917. So you can imagine what happens without going into the awful detail of a body that lays out there in the sunlight and then the winter and the rain for that long a period of time. And unfortunately that meant that a lot of the casualties couldn't be identified, making it even sadder for the families who were affected by this because they didn't have the closure of knowing 100% that their family member, friend, son, husband had been killed here. And so huge numbers of the graves here are unidentified. But some of them are identified. Some of the graves we do know who lay in them, and we're going to go take a little bit of a look around now. So we talked about some of the York and Lancaster regiments that fought here. So here is F. Greaves of the York and Lancaster Regiment, killed here on the 1st of July 1916. Unfortunately, next to several unknown soldiers, one of which is also from the York and Lancaster Regiment. So whilst we do have named graves here, like C. Bulpit from the Hampshire Regiment, who was killed here in the fighting later in 1916, as we mentioned, a huge number of the burials here are unknown. So to give you an idea, we have a soldier of the Hampshire Regiment, unknown, a soldier of the Rifle Brigade, unknown, another Hampshire Regiment, unknown, Royal Sussex Regiment, unknown, a soldier of the Great War, unknown, a soldier of the Hampshire Regiment, until eventually we do have another named casualty, C. Dawkins of the Hampshire Regiment. You get an idea of the huge number of unknown graves that lay in this cemetery. Now there's soldiers from all over the British Empire here at this cemetery. To give you an idea, here are a couple of soldiers of the Great War from the Canadian regiments, unknown unfortunately, and I've seen graves here from Australia and all around the different areas of the Allied forces that fought here. The next grave we're going to take a brief look at is the grave of Horace Isles. He died here in the attack on the first day of the Somme when he was only 16 years old. He has an incredible story and I've done a whole video on it, so I'm going to link that at the end of this video. If you'd like to go see that, I really recommend it. It tells you one of these specific personal stories of one of the men, one of the very, very young men who died here in that attack on the first day of the Somme. But Horace Isles lays here in Serre Road Cemetery #1. So here is the grave of Horace Isles, West Yorkshire Regiment, 1st of July 1916, only 16 years old. He lays here with his comrades, also of the West Yorkshire Regiment. I highly recommend checking out the video I did on Horace. A really great story. So the attack here at Serre had failed, and it had had a huge effect on communities at home. Communities such as Accrington lost a whole generation of men. Husbands, sons, friends, work colleagues wiped out in one day of fighting. And that was the problem with the Pals battalions, is that if they were involved in an attack that failed, as they were here on the first day of the Somme, it had a huge effect on the community that Pals battalion came from. The lesson was learned, and not long after that, the idea of recruiting Pals battalions stopped altogether. But it doesn't change the awful effect that it had on communities like Sheffield, Barnsley, Accrington. It's an awful tragedy what happened here on the first day of the Somme. The land here at Serre wouldn't be captured for the Germans until 1917, early 1917, and hence why the battlefield was then cleared at that point. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. It's a sad one to finish off here at the cemetery, but I hope you found it interesting. I really recommend coming here if you come to tour the Somme. Sheffield Memorial Park and the Serre Road cemeteries are a definite place to visit, and in fact probably a great place to start your tour if you are coming to the Somme. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, I'm going to ask you to do me a little favour, do me all the usual YouTube stuff, hit the like button, subscribe and all that stuff. Guys, thank you very much for watching. I'm going to see you on the next one.